Everyone thought Toyota had made a mistake, while Tesla was dominating headlines, while BYD was breaking sales records, and while almost every major automaker was racing toward an all-electric future, Toyota seemed to be standing still. Critics called the company slow. Some investors questioned its strategy. Others went even further, claiming Toyota had completely misread where the industry was heading. And honestly, it looked that way. Year after year, new EV announcements flooded the market. Automakers competed over bigger batteries, longer range, and faster charging speeds. The message felt clear. Electric vehicles were the future. And anyone not fully committed risked being left behind. But behind closed doors, Toyota was doing something very different. Instead of joining the rush, the company was spending years working on a technology most people had already stopped talking about. Not because it was old, not because it was safe, but because Toyota believed the biggest problem facing the auto industry wasn't being solved at all, and that belief eventually led to a decision that could reshape the conversation around electric vehicles entirely. The strange part is that Toyota wasn't making this decision based on predictions. It was basing it on something much harder to ignore: reality. Because outside major cities, outside wealthy markets, and outside technology conferences, millions of drivers were facing challenges that no amount of marketing could erase. Long road trips still depended on charging stations that often weren't there. Cold weather still affected battery performance. Charging times were improving, but filling a fuel tank still took only a few minutes. And in many parts of the world, the infrastructure needed for a full EV transition simply didn't exist. Toyota saw all of it. The company wasn't asking whether electric vehicles could work, it was asking whether they could work for everyone. And that single question would become the foundation of a strategy that many people dismissed at first, but are now beginning to take much more seriously. What makes this story interesting isn't that Toyota disagreed with the industry's direction, it's that the company was willing to risk looking wrong for years while pursuing an alternative path. Most companies react to pressure. Toyota seemed determined to ignore it. The criticism kept growing. Every successful EV launch made Toyota's hybrid-focused approach look increasingly outdated. Headlines questioned why the world's largest automaker wasn't moving faster. Analysts debated whether the company was protecting old technology instead of embracing the future. Yet, Toyota remained remarkably consistent, and the reason goes back much further than most people realize. Nearly 3 decades ago, long before electric vehicles became mainstream, Toyota introduced a car that many people laughed at: the Prius. At the time, combining a gasoline engine with an electric motor seemed unnecessary and complicated. Few believed hybrid technology would become anything significant, but Toyota kept improving it. Year after year, generation after generation, millions of vehicles were sold, billions of miles were driven, and quietly, Toyota accumulated something that no laboratory could manufacture overnight: experience. What nobody realized was that all of that experience was leading somewhere. And this is where the story starts to get interesting. Because while competitors were focused on building the next generation of EVs, Toyota was gathering data from real drivers across countless countries, climates, and road conditions. Every traffic jam, every highway trip, every hot summer and freezing winter. The company was learning how people actually used their vehicles. And eventually, that information began shaping a new project. A project that wouldn't simply improve an existing hybrid system, it would attempt to redefine what a hybrid could be. But that only matters once you see what happened next. Toyota's engineers weren't trying to build a car that would impress people during a presentation. They were trying to solve a much harder problem. How do you give drivers the smoothness of an electric vehicle without forcing them to depend on charging stations? How do you reduce fuel consumption without asking people to completely change the way they travel? And most importantly, how do you build a system that can survive years of daily use in places where perfect infrastructure simply doesn't exist? The answers became the foundation of what Toyota now calls its 6th-generation hybrid system. At first glance, that name doesn't sound revolutionary. In fact, most people hear the word hybrid and imagine a slightly more efficient version of what already exists. But Toyota wasn't looking at individual upgrades. It was redesigning the entire relationship between the engine, the battery, and the electric motor. And that's where things become surprisingly important. One of the biggest complaints about older hybrids was that drivers could sometimes feel the vehicle switching between gasoline power and electric power. The transition wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. A small hesitation, a slight change in feel, a reminder that two different systems were constantly sharing the workload. Toyota wanted that sensation to disappear. The company spent years refining how the engine and motor communicate with each other, aiming for transitions so smooth that drivers wouldn't even notice them happening. On paper, that sounds like a minor improvement. In reality, it changes how the entire vehicle feels, because the less you notice the technology working, the more natural the experience becomes. But smoother driving wasn't the real goal. It was only the beginning. The bigger challenge involved power. For years, electric vehicles had one advantage that drivers loved almost immediately: instant torque. The moment you touch the accelerator, power arrives. No waiting, no buildup, just immediate response. Toyota new hybrids needed more of that feeling. So engineers focused heavily on the electric motor. Reports suggest the new motor is smaller than before, yet more powerful and more efficient at the same time. That combination sounds simple. It's not. Making something smaller usually means accepting compromises. Toyota wanted the opposite. A motor that consumed less energy while delivering stronger performance. A motor capable of making city driving feel more responsive without increasing fuel consumption. And if those claims prove accurate, the impact extends far beyond acceleration, because every bit of efficiency gained from the motor reduces the burden on the gasoline engine, which leads directly to the next piece of the puzzle, a component most drivers will never see. And yet, it might be one of the most important parts of the entire system. The power control unit, think of it as the vehicle's decision-making center. Every second, it evaluates countless variables. Should the engine run? Should the motor take over? Should both systems work together? How much power is needed right now? How much energy should be saved for later? Most people never think about these decisions because they're happening in the background. But Toyota believes faster and smarter decisions can create a noticeable difference in both performance and efficiency, especially during the unpredictable moments that happen every day: merging onto a highway, passing a slower vehicle, navigating stop-and-go traffic, tiny moments that collectively determine whether a vehicle feels effortless or frustrating. And yet, even all of these improvements weren't what caught the industry's attention. The real fascination started when experts began looking at something much less exciting: the battery dot, because Toyota's entire strategy depends on one critical assumption: that drivers don't necessarily want bigger batteries, they want fewer compromises. And that's a very different goal. For years, the EV conversation centered around battery size: larger packs, longer range, more charging capacity. Toyota looked at the problem differently. What if the smartest battery wasn't the biggest one? What if it was simply the one that never asked anything from the driver? That idea became central to the new system. The battery charges itself, not occasionally, constantly. Every slowdown, every stoplight, every moment the vehicle isn't using its full power. Energy that would normally disappear is captured and stored, then reused when needed. The process sounds almost ordinary today, but Toyota believes the next generation performs this task far more effectively than before. And if that's true, it creates an interesting possibility: a vehicle that behaves more like an EV during daily driving, while eliminating one of the biggest concerns people still have about EV ownership: the need to stop and recharge. But here's where the story becomes uncomfortable for some automakers, because Toyota isn't really competing against electric vehicles alone. It's competing against assumptions. Assumptions about what customers actually want. Assumptions about how quickly infrastructure will improve. Assumptions about whether the future will belong to one technology or several. And those assumptions are about to face their biggest test yet. The companies watching Toyota most closely understand something that casual observers often miss. Technology doesn't win simply because it's newer. It wins when enough people decide it solves their problems better than the alternatives. And right now, the auto industry is discovering that reality is far more complicated than many expected. Take Tesla, for example. The company transformed the entire market. It proved that electric vehicles could be desirable, fast, and practical. Without Tesla, the global EV movement probably wouldn't look the way it does today. But Tesla's success also created an assumption that eventually everyone would move toward the same destination: fully electric transportation. For years,